Trump doubles down on tariffs. Steel and aluminum now taxed at 50%. Canada threatens steel firewall. Japan signs deal but delays security talks with US. On June 3, 2025, President Trump triggered a global chain reaction. With a stroke of a pen, the United States doubled its tariffs on foreign metals, sending markets reeling and longtime allies scrambling. Canada lost 23,000 steel jobs in weeks. Japan rushed to negotiate. Korea struck a billion-dollar deal to avoid the axe. But beneath the surface, something deeper was shifting. For the first time, allies weren't just reacting. They were repositioning. What happens when America demands control and its closest partners decide they no longer need permission? For decades, metals, steel, and aluminum formed more than just the backbone of North American industry. They were the raw currency of trust between nations. Under NAFTA and later USMCA, Canada, the US and Mexico built an interdependent system of extraction, processing, and manufacturing that fueled everything from skyscrapers to fighter jets. Canada's steel flowed south to Detroit for cars. US aluminum helped power aircraft built in Quebec. Japan, though not a regional partner, was a strategic ally. Its high-grade steel and precision components crucial for aerospace, automotive, and defense projects across North America. This system wasn't just efficient, it was symbolic. A post-Cold War supply chain built on stability and shared purpose. But by the mid-2020s, cracks had begun to form. Trump's America First agenda, revived in his second term, challenged every assumption about partnership. Section 232 tariffs on metals, first introduced in 2018, were quietly revived in early 2025. Trade uncertainty surged. Then, on June 3rd, Trump signed an executive order raising tariffs on imported steel and aluminum from 25% to a staggering 50%, effective immediately. The only exception, the United Kingdom. It was a shot across the bow, not just at China, but at allies who had come to rely on the US as both a market and a partner. Canada, with tens of thousands of jobs tied to steel exports, was blindsided. Japan, caught in a delicate security alliance with Washington, was presented with a stark ultimatum: accept a permanent 15% auto tariff or face full retaliation. South Korea, still reeling from earlier tariff threats, scrambled to finalize a compromise deal, trading market access for a $350 billion investment commitment. What began as a policy shift was now a geopolitical rupture, and for the first time, America's allies weren't waiting to be punished. They were preparing to walk away. America's power play. The steel trap. When President Trump signed the June 3, 2025 executive order doubling tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, the message was clear: control the metals, control the system. Framed under national security grounds via Section 232, the policy aimed to punish foreign producers for unfair competition, restore domestic output, and force allies back into bilateral submission. It wasn't just about economics. It was about leverage. Trump's inner circle had long believed that America's supply chain dependencies gave its rivals and even its friends too much power. The new tariffs, they claimed, would correct that. Domestic producers in states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Missouri cheered. U.S. steel and Alcoa stocks spiked temporarily. Conservative commentators hailed it as a realignment of the industrial heartland. But reality hit fast. For Canada, the largest supplier of both aluminum and steel to the U.S., the damage was immediate. Within 2 weeks, over 9,000 aluminum workers and nearly 23,000 steel workers faced layoffs or forced furloughs. Orders from U.S. buyers evaporated overnight. Companies like Stelco and Rio Tinto declared emergency production halts. At Hamilton's industrial port, ships stood idle. Markets reacted. The North American auto and construction sectors saw costs spike. A ton of rebar from Ontario suddenly cost 38% more than before the tariff. Builders postponed projects. U.S. manufacturers dependent on Canadian alloys scrambled to find domestic alternatives, only to discover insufficient capacity and higher prices. Japan, though spared from the full 50% metal tariff, was served a deadline: agree to a 15% fixed tariff on all auto exports to the U.S. by July 9th or face additional measures. The logic was clear: secure a symbolic win before the November 2026 midterms. Tokyo was being asked to trade short-term stability for long-term submission. South Korea, having faced a similar ultimatum in April, had already conceded. By July, Seoul signed a sweeping deal. It accepted a 15% tariff on industrial exports, pledged $350 billion in U.S. infrastructure investments, and committed to $100 billion in American energy imports. In return, South Korean companies were granted limited exemptions and continued access to the U.S. auto market. But even as these deals were signed, confidence in Washington's consistency eroded. The unpredictability of Trump's economic warfare and the speed with which trade policy turned into coercive diplomacy raised alarm bells among allies and investors alike. By late July, U.S. global investment inflows fell 12% quarter over quarter. Capital began flowing into stability hubs: Canada, Japan, and the European Union. ETF funds tracking U.S. manufacturing saw $1.4 billion in outflows. The dollar slipped against the yen and Canadian dollar. At home, the domestic metal industry didn't boom. It buckled under weight of volatility. While tariffs temporarily shielded a few producers, others found export markets closing in retaliation. Steel prices surged domestically, hurting downstream industries. Small manufacturers in Wisconsin and Indiana canceled orders. The American construction lobby warned of price-induced stagnation. The White House refused to blink. Strategic pain is necessary, a spokesperson told Politico. This is about restoring American leverage. But with allies scrambling to shield themselves and rivals quietly forming new trade blocs, the question lingered: who was really being cornered? Canada and Japan. Pushback, not over Canada, didn't retaliate with fury. It retaliated with structure. Just days after the June 3rd announcement, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, under guidance from Mark Carney, held an emergency meeting with Canadian trade leaders and provincial premiers. The strategy that emerged wasn't about escalation, it was about insulation. Carney unveiled what he dubbed the steel firewall, a sweeping policy that included counter tariffs of up to 50% on select U.S. metals, new federal procurement rules favoring domestic suppliers, and export restrictions on strategic inputs like processed aluminum sheets and rare earths. He also floated a cap on U.S. imports for industrial categories historically dominated by American firms. More significantly, Canada initiated fast-track trade integration with Japan and the EU. Ottawa and Tokyo jointly announced new CPTPP alignment on strategic raw materials, aiming to reduce dependence on U.S. buyers. Meanwhile, trade officials from Canada and the EU began formalizing cooperation on green steel projects and hydrogen development. At the port of Vancouver, containers once headed to U.S. markets were rerouted to Yokohama. In Quebec, smelters that had supplied Boeing's subcontractors pivoted toward German automakers. A quiet but forceful pivot was underway. The Canadian public, long wary of being caught in Washington's crossfire, largely supported the shift. National polls showed a 68% approval for rebalancing trade alliances. Even traditionally pro-American business groups acknowledged the risk of continued U.S. exposure. Japan took a different route: pragmatic, subtle, and surgical. Faced with Trump's July 9th deadline, Japan agreed to the 15% tariff on automotive exports, but not without conditions. The deal included a most favored nation clause, ensuring that if the U.S. ever struck a better deal with another country, Japan would automatically receive equal terms. It also carved out provisions to protect high-tech automotive parts and electric vehicles from future sanctions. More tellingly, Japan postponed its scheduled 2+2 security meeting with the U.S. It wasn't a protest, it was a signal. Trade came first. Defense cooperation would wait. Behind closed doors, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry intensified negotiations with Canada and South Korea on securing rare earth metals and semiconductors. Tokyo also initiated discussions with the EU on shared investment in hydrogen production and cross-border carbon-free logistics. In essence, Japan made its choice: remain in partnership with the US, but build the exits just in case. Together, Canada and Japan weren't forming a bloc, but they were drawing the lines of a new era: post-American economic sovereignty built not on defiance, but diversification. And for the first time, the US wasn't at the center of every deal. It was one of many players, sometimes invited, sometimes not. An unstable standoff. By August 2025, the tension was no longer about tariffs. It was about what came next. Canada's steel plants were still bleeding jobs, but its government had gained leverage. Japan had avoided disaster, but only by embedding fail-safes into its deal. South Korea's mega investment deal granted temporary relief, but executives in Seoul expressed growing unease over the sustainability of any US agreement. Even the European Union, once on the sidelines, saw the writing on the wall. Brussels quietly initiated talks with Ottawa and Tokyo on forming a coordinated trade response mechanism, an informal insurance policy against future economic coercion by any major power, including the United States. Meanwhile, US policymakers struggled with the optics. While Trump touted the strongest tariffs in American history, domestic industries dependent on metal inputs were buckling. Tool and die shops in Michigan laid off workers. Home builders in Texas paused construction over rebar costs. Midwestern governors privately warned the White House of an industrial pullback heading into the election cycle. Still, Washington refused to adjust course. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin defended the tariffs as the foundation of a new trade equilibrium. Commerce Secretary Peter Navarro, brought back as a special advisor, claimed that US self-sufficiency in metals was finally within reach. Markets weren't convinced. By late August, aluminum futures had risen 34% from their pre-tariff baseline, and investor confidence in US-based manufacturing ETFs hit a 2-year low. Behind the geopolitical maneuvering, a strategic question haunted every boardroom from Montreal to Tokyo to Seoul. Can America still be trusted to lead a rules-based economic order? The answer wasn't clear, but the hedging had begun. Canada accelerated domestic reindustrialization efforts, pouring $8.2 billion into green steel innovation and partnering with Germany's Salzgitter AG to scale zero-emissions smelting. Japan pushed forward on AI-based supply chain diversification, rerouting chip assembly away from US-sensitive nodes. And in both countries, political narratives shifted. It was no longer about defending against Trump. It was about defending against any future swing in Washington. As one Canadian senator put it on national television, "We can't build a 21st century economy on 20th century dependency." And so the US, once the gravitational center of global trade, now found itself orbiting around a new reality: fragmented alliances, parallel supply chains, and skeptical partners, not out of hostility, but out of necessity. Canada's cold wake-up in Hamilton. In the city of Hamilton, Ontario, long considered the beating heart of Canada's steel industry, the June 2025 tariff spike landed like a bomb. Stelco, one of the city's largest employers, had built its business model on steady US exports. Before the tariff hike, nearly 40% of Stelco's steel, especially rebar and flat-rolled products, was shipped to American construction firms. But when Trump's executive order doubled the import tariff to 50%, orders dried up within days. By mid-June, Stelco had furloughed 3,800 workers. Smaller suppliers, like tube welders, scrap recyclers, and coating firms, followed suit. At Dofasco, another major player in the area, shifts were cut and maintenance projects delayed. Local restaurants saw lunchtime traffic cut in half. Schools reported sudden enrollment drops as families packed up and left for cheaper housing. What stung more than the economics was the psychology. Hamilton's workforce had weathered the 2008 financial crisis, the 2018 tariffs, and COVID-era disruptions. But this felt different. This was a political decision by a longtime ally, made without consultation and executed with surgical speed. To cope, Canada deployed federal stimulus, wage subsidies, and retraining grants. But the real shift came in direction. The government fast-tracked a $1.5 billion investment into green steel pilot programs, less reliant on export margins and more aligned with EU carbon targets. Germany's Salzgitter AG and Quebec-based Enercom were brought in to build a hydrogen-integrated smelter outside Hamilton. But new technology didn't replace lost pride overnight. One foreman at the Hamilton dockyard said, "We used to build the steel that built America. Now we're being told to build for ourselves." Canada hadn't started this battle, but it now understood dependency came at a cost. Even in peace, a neighbor can bring war if you rely too much on their market. America's Midwest, in metal shock, in Peoria, Illinois, home to dozens of small and mid-sized manufacturing firms, the ripple effects of Trump's steel tariffs weren't theoretical. They were catastrophic. Archer Engineering, a 70-year-old precision parts firm supplying the construction equipment sector, relied on low-cost steel imports from Canada for custom-fabricated machinery. Within 3 weeks of the June 3rd tariff, the price of input materials jumped 44%. By July, Archer had canceled 5 contracts due to margin collapse. A third of its 220 employees were laid off. Worse, domestic steel alternatives weren't available in time. Backlogged orders, logistical delays, and domestic price gouging made production planning nearly impossible. The company's CEO told Reuters, "We're not anti-American steel, we're anti-unpredictability." Across the Midwest, it was the same story. In Ohio, a tool and die shop shut its doors after 50 years in business. In Indiana, a pipeline welding firm postponed expansion plans, citing unstable market conditions caused by policy whiplash. Farm equipment manufacturers in Iowa delayed product rollouts. Even school district maintenance budgets were strained, unable to afford tariff-bloated metal prices for HVAC repairs and gymnasium bleachers. The pain wasn't limited to industry. By late July, mid-sized construction projects began stalling, parking garages, overpasses, and civic centers, due to skyrocketing steel prices. Local governments found themselves choosing between project delays or higher taxes. Public backlash grew. Republican governors in Kentucky and Missouri, both strongholds of Trump's political base, quietly lobbied for sector-specific exemptions. Financial markets noticed. Shares in U.S. construction supply firms fell 17% from May to August. Aluminum-dependent aerospace contractors raised red flags, and hedge funds began shifting positions into Canadian and Japanese metal producers, betting against American certainty. Trump remained defiant, framing the short-term pain as sacrifice for sovereignty. But in union halls and shop floors, the sentiment was shifting. Workers didn't feel sovereign. They felt discarded. The tariffs had promised a revival. Instead, they delivered a reckoning. And America's heartland was once again forced to ask, at what cost? North America once thrived on a promise: build together, rise together. But now, tariffs have fractured that pact. Canada's steel towns are pivoting inward. Japan is hedging outward. And America, once the axis of trust, is tightening its grip while watching its alliances loosen. This isn't a story about winners and losers. It's about erosion. When trade becomes a weapon, even allies become adversaries. When rules are bent for leverage, trust bends with them, and sometimes breaks. And as the world reorders itself around climate, technology, and shared security, one question looms. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or lose everything trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your view in the comments below.